glad to see you back on my channel. Do you remember the first time you felt jealous? Perhaps your school crush was chatting to someone else, or your high school sweetheart was texting someone you didn't feel comfortable with. Still, no matter how uncomfortable you felt, I'm sure you didn't think to kill for it. Sometimes teenagers go to extreme lengths to secure their first love, but that can be very toxic. Maybe the other person has moved on, or simply doesn't feel the other way. It's never okay to limit someone's freedom, and if you're hurting others for it, it's even worse. Tragically, these things happen, and not just in the adult world. In 2016, Matthew Borges reached a breaking point. His girlfriend had broken up with him, but he couldn't stand her talking to other boys. He was possessive, aggressive, and getting more jealous by the minute. One day, he decided to end the life of the last boy he saw, talking with his ex-girlfriend. He was 15 years old. Trigger warning, this case is as graphic as it is upsetting. Our story takes place in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Lawrence is a pretty big city. Not quite as big as its neighbor, Boston, but it's lively, busy, and a great place for teenagers to have fun. Back in 2016, Lawrence was the home of 16-year-old Lee-Manuel Viloria-Paulino. Yep, he was born with the start of the new millennium. Lee was a very likable boy, calm, sensitive, and very funny. He would volunteer to help everyone around him. Be it his classmates at Lawrence High School, family, or friends, he was popular, but he wasn't arrogant. He enjoyed being around people, and people enjoyed being around him. Lee was also an aspiring artist. He dabbled in everything from art to music and poetry. He was truly talented, and his family supported his dream of becoming a writer. His family had moved to Massachusetts from the Dominican Republic in the late 1990s. Lee had grown up with his mom, grandparents, uncles, and cousins. It was a large, lively family who loved to laugh. Most of them lived in the same huge house. They were a tight-knit community of best friends. They were very close. Lee and his grandma were so close that every time Lee got home after school, he would hug her and tell her, "I love you." She'd reply, "I love you more." But this picture-perfect family was about to suffer the worst tragedy they could imagine. On November 18th, 2016, Lee was reported missing to the police. He had left his family home at around 5:30 p.m. the previous day and never returned. When his mom checked his room, it was a mess. His phone and wallet were still inside the house. This was very strange and very worrying. The officers were considering this a runaway, but Lee's mother knew this wasn't her son. It was not his habit to run away from home. And as far as she knew, he had no reason to do it now either. And why would he leave his phone at home if he knew he would go away for longer? The only clue the police had was that Lee was planning to go to the riverbank at Merrimack River with his friend and classmate, 15-year-old Matthew Borges. Matthew had texted him just a few hours before his disappearance. So the police went over to the Borges home and questioned Matthew. He looked quite surprised that his friend was missing. He said yes, they did meet that evening. They went to the riverbank, smoked some weed, and parted ways. He hadn't seen Lee after that. But days turned to weeks, and the police weren't getting anywhere closer to finding Lee. Still, they had a hunch about the last boy he'd seen. On November 29th, almost 2 weeks since Lee's disappearance, Matthew and his father were asked once again to come to the police station. The detectives insisted that if he knew anything, this was the time to say it. But Matthew kept his ground too. He knew nothing. In fact, he said he only learned about Lee's disappearance on November 18th at work.
The girl I was talking to told me, she said, "Have you seen Lee?" I was like, "Yeah, I was with him the other day." And I was like, "Why? What happened?" She said, "He's missing." I was like, "Wow."
And if he knew Lee, he'd probably run off somewhere on his own. At the police's request, Matthew even took the officers to where he'd met Lee last time. It was a pretty strange story, and Lee's family insisted that their son wouldn't run away. But the police couldn't arrest Matthew on a hunch. All that was left to do was search for Lee throughout Lawrence and all its surroundings. But nothing happened for 3 long weeks. It was the first day of December, and a Lawrence resident, Omar Medina, was walking his dogs near the Merrimack River. Suddenly, his dog took a turn toward the river and followed him. On the riverbank, he saw something he will never forget.
As I approached, I got closer, saw her really sniffing at a particular area. So I pulled her back, and when I looked, I kind of second-guessed myself. I thought I saw a dead body, but I wasn't too sure, because, it was missing some limbs.
It was a beheaded body, impaled 76 times, and dismembered beyond recognition. His hands had been cut off too. Imagine having to call 911 and describe this. This was not an easy task for the police either. Dealing with a crime so graphic and so heinous leaves marks on the toughest professionals out there. Lee's head was found by a state trooper. It was wrapped in a plastic bag floating in the river. The body was examined, and sadly, it was identified as 16-year-old Lee. The medical examiner said that they couldn't determine whether his head had been severed before or after he was dead. As if the crime wasn't horrendous enough. His family was devastated. They barely felt alive anymore. They needed answers quickly, and they were frustrated that the police took this long to find Lee's body.
If it was their kid, would they have waited 2 weeks to look for him?
Needless to say, the first thing officers did was interview Matthew Borges. After all, Lee was supposed to meet him on the night of his disappearance. This time, the police had a body that had been found on the very same riverbank the boys were supposed to spend time at. All evidence pointed towards the 15-year-old. He was immediately arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of his classmate Lee. But this was hardly any justice for the Lawrence community or Lee's heartbroken family.
It's very awful and just in disbelief at this point.
Heartbreak is an understatement. How can you live after knowing your son's life ended? Now everybody wanted answers to the big question.
Why would someone do this? Why?
Why had a 15-year-old killed his classmate? And how could he commit such a gruesome act? It was all about to be revealed in a lengthy, tiresome, and emotionally draining trial. Matthew Borges' trial began in 2019 when he was 18 years old. Although he was 15 at the time of the crime, this was such a brutal one, the judge agreed to try him as an adult.
Well, today, the man who found the beheaded body of a Lawrence teenager testified against the accused killer, the accused killer's classmate.
Several people testified against Matthew, including many of his classmates. The jury needed to paint a picture. Who was Matthew? What was he like? Were there any signs of his troubling behavior early on? His classmates described him as a smart kid who was usually quiet in class. But although many of his classmates described him as a shy boy, they also pointed to the fact that he was visibly troubled at times. It turns out he had quite a lot of trouble at home. At the very least, he was witness to violence in his family. The case was dismissed and no one was arrested. But this doesn't mean the incident didn't leave a mark on Matthew. And who knows how many more incidents were at home and hadn't been reported to the police. Many victims of domestic abuse choose not to go to the police. Perhaps they still believe their partner could change, or they're too afraid of them to make such a big move. Sometimes they mistrust the police too. As you probably know, the police don't always protect the victim or do the right thing. Anyways, back to Matthew. No matter what happened at his home, his schoolmates could see him act out. One of his classmates said Matthew had a short fuse and that often resorted to fighting instead of talking. As people came one by one to testify against Borges, a vital clue into the story came out. Matthew had been dating a girl named Leilani de Jesus. They were together for 9 months, and during this time they were exceptionally close. From the outside, it seemed like all they had was each other. It sounded like a really beautiful high school love story, but it really wasn't. Matthew was very possessive of Leilani from the get-go. He kept getting jealous whenever Leilani would speak to other boys. They would fight every time he had a feeling she didn't care for him. Once, Matthew gave Leilani a list of all the boys he thought she was cheating on him with. Sheesh! When it all got too much for her, she called it quits with Matthew. He was possessive and aggressive, and she didn't need that. Nobody does. But instead of earning herself some peace and quiet, breaking up with Matthew only made him angrier and more possessive. Whenever Leilani would talk to another boy, Matthew was there, watching, judging, and bursting out in front of everyone. One day, Leilani was in the cafeteria during lunch break, and she was chatting with Lee. Matthew saw this, and he lost it. He shouted such ugly things at Leilani that a teacher turned up and took Matthew out of the cafeteria. This was a big red flag. His behavior was only getting worse, but everyone hoped he would eventually get used to Leilani being her own person and he would live and let live. Sadly, this wasn't the case. First, Matthew started flirting with another girl, Stephanie Serrano. She was also in his school but in a different class. Apart from flirting a little bit during lunch breaks, the two would text almost constantly via phone and Facebook. Stephanie liked Matthew for being an intelligent, playful person. Matthew had saved her in his phone as Baby. However, they agreed they wouldn't enter a relationship for quite some time. They were going to take things slow. One time, Matthew texted Stephanie that, "I'd like to call you Bae, or even Baby, or maybe Wifey one day. I have goals to achieve first." Stephanie didn't like feeling rushed either, so she was okay with taking it slowly. But as they got closer, Matthew started revealing what he called his demons. He was a jealous person and hadn't gotten over Leilani speaking to other boys. In fact, now he was getting jealous of Stephanie, too. One time he texted her saying that he could never date her since she had way too many guy friends. Then, things only started going downhill. Matthew's text to Stephanie only got more possessive and more aggressive by the week. He would ask her what took her so long to get home from school, accusing her of being with side guys, and even of flirting with Lee. Yes, the same Lee that he ended up killing. It seems like Matthew wasn't self-confident around Lee. Perhaps he felt Lee was better looking or more charming or more confident around the girls he liked. Slowly, Matthew was developing very dark fantasies. The more possessive Matthew was of Stephanie, the more she pulled back. It's natural. No one wants to feel suffocated or threatened, but Matthew didn't realize this. So the more she pulled back, the more he attacked her. Once he wrote to her, "Shut the f*** up. You do as I say, when I say." Stephanie was shocked at this behavior and texted him back asking why he was acting this way. Immediately, Matthew pulled back and called her Baby in his next text. Imagine how tiring it must be to deal with someone who gives you such mixed messages. But Matthew was still stuck on Lee. Once he messaged Stephanie upset that she said hi to Lee but not to him. Then he wrote that he would kill anyone who got in the way of me getting what I want. And his messages only got more and more alarming. This is a text message Matthew sent Stephanie just 2 days before the murder. "I think of killing someone and I smirk. I like the sound of it, the idea of causing pain. It's all I think about every day. But I control myself. I see people I don't like and that comes to mind. I'm going insane." Stephanie texted him back, asking him if there was anything she could do to stop him from going insane. He wrote, "I'll hide it in the back of my mind like always." In another text message, he promised Stephanie she would see the difference in his eye after he commits murder. "Take a good look at my eyes the next time we talk, because that's the last time you're going to see them like that ever again." Stephanie didn't lose hope for Matthew. She wanted to help him. When he texted her asking if his eyes looked dead, she wrote, "Yours look dark, but they want to shine again." She believed Matthew wanted to change. Why would he keep sharing all of his dark thoughts with her if he didn't? Matthew then told Stephanie he wanted to share even darker thoughts with her. So Stephanie said she was all ears. He then sent her a 48-second voice memo that was played in court by the prosecution. Matthew kept talking about dark eyes that don't shine and people that have lost their humanity and their souls. It was a very dark voice memo for a 15-year-old. And just before Halloween that year, Matthew had written on his Facebook page, "Guys, I'm gonna kill someone on Halloween. I'm not lying. So if you hear someone dead on the news, we know, I just want to say that y'all gonna look at me different." Matthew had dark plans for the boy he didn't like. Lee was talking to his ex-girlfriend and to the girl he wanted to date. In Matthew's mind, he had to suffer. But it didn't start with a murder. Matthew initially wanted to break into Lee's home and steal his PlayStation, belts, and clothes. He wanted to lure Lee out of the house so that his friends would break in and steal his most precious belongings. So, in the afternoon, Matthew turned up at Lee's house and invited him out, saying they should go out by the river and smoke. Lee liked the invitation and tagged along. Matthew's friends did as they had agreed. Once Lee was out, they climbed into his room and took whatever they could find. Just around this time, Lee's uncle got home from work and saw two boys walking across his backyard. They were a bit too far away to see if one of them was Lee or not, so he called over to them, but they didn't reply. They just kept moving. Then, Lee's uncle got into Lee's bedroom and saw he wasn't there. Not only was he not there, but the whole place was a mess. He hadn't seen the boys come in and steal his belongings, so he didn't realize what had happened. He thought, maybe Lee snuck out of their home for the night. He and Lee's grandma waited all evening for Lee to come back. We waited, assuming he would come home. We were listening intently for noise upstairs, but didn't hear anything at all. Lee's mom was visiting the Dominican Republic for a few days, so she wasn't home. But the next morning, when Lee still hadn't come home, the family decided to report him missing. Then, on the evening of November 18th, Matthew called his most trusted friend, Jonathan Miranda, to scratch the robbery plans. He said, "I killed him. He's dead." Apparently, he even told him that he'd cut off his head and hands so that he wouldn't be caught.
He told me that he killed Lee and off his head.
I feel like this is becoming a nasty, recurrent story. But Matthew's friends didn't take him seriously. When speaking at the trial, Matthew's friends said he did hear his confession, but Matthew usually said weird things, so he never thought he would actually be speaking the truth.
The plan was for Matthew to distract Lee.
Fine, but what about when Lee never turned up to school the next day? Or the next? Why didn't they call the police?
I heard him, he said he killed them.
How was he speaking? Do you remember anything about his voice?
Scared, crying.
Did he tell you why he stabbed him in the throat?
Yeah.
Why did he say that?
Because he wouldn't shut up.
Teenagers really don't want to believe that their friends are capable of doing the unspeakable?
He has common sense. He's the type of kid that has common sense. I don't believe the fact that he would do that because it's just not him.
Or is the truth a darker one? Were Matthew's friends trying to cover for him? After all, saying you didn't take someone's word seriously can definitely get you out of trouble. Furthermore, the boy testifying here was Jonathan Miranda, the same boy who led the burglary in Lee's room. But since he was in court, he was already in trouble. All boys admitted to the burglary, as well as testified against Matthew. Another boy, Engel Betancourt, testified that Matthew had come over after the murder, saying, "My hands were bloody. He came at me the wrong way, so I had to do what I had to do." Just how innocent were these kids? No matter how close you are to someone, if you found out they just killed someone, perhaps it would be better to report them to the police. Don't you think? It was actually Stephanie who reported Matthew to the police. Thankfully, some teenagers do know when things are getting really serious. In fact, if it wasn't for Stephanie, it would have taken a long time for the police to arrest Matthew. They still had no physical evidence on him. In fact, this is what Matthew Borges' defense team was going for. Since there was still no physical evidence linking Matthew to the crime, he could still be considered innocent.
There is no murder weapon. There is no tools to dismember a body. There are no fingerprints, there is no blood, there is no DNA, and there is no motive.
But the texts he'd sent Stephanie were damaging enough. And on top of this, the police had found Matthew's diary. The prosecution read his last entry before the murder.
Kill him. Bring duffel bag, wear gloves, clean up mess, wear bags on shoes, wear clothes you don't care about.
Yeah. Apart from a few cuts on Matthew's hands, there was zero evidence that linked him to Lee's murder. But it was all too clear. He was guilty, and he wasn't even trying to hide it. He just stood there, poker-faced, listening to all his former friends and schoolmates testifying against him. And at the end of the trial, he had nothing to say to Lee's family. Not only did they have to sit through weeks of horrific moments, reliving their worst nightmare and learning ever more gruesome details about the crime against Lee, but they also got no apology and no closure from the young murderer.
On November 18, 2016, our world was irreversibly changed when Limano was taken from us. He was just 16 years old when he was murdered. And every day we struggle with the fact that his life was cut too short when he was in the cusp of so much.
Still, Matthew's defense attorney insisted all he did in his texts was joke about having a dark side. He never spoke seriously, and he never planned any murder. Really? Being a state attorney might just be a job for some, but I can't imagine defending someone like Matthew. Everyone else requested the maximum sentence.
We hope that the sentence handed down serves to help him find remorse and repentance in his life. We reaffirm that the assassin of Viloria-Paulino should receive the maximum sentence.
The prosecutor stressed the heinous nature of Matthew's crime.
Extreme atrocity and cruelty, which carries with it a life sentence with a parole eligibility date of 30 years. That's not discretionary. So I guess what we're talking about here is what sentence he should receive on the deliberate premeditation portion of the verdict.
He also said that no matter how much time Matthew spends behind bars, it will do little to alleviate the family's pain.
Whatever sentence is decided upon, no term of years will bring Lee back. But it can both send a message to the defendant and the community loud and clear.
In May 2019, Matthew Borges was sentenced to prison for 30 years to life. In a really sad twist, in August 2013, Lee's father, Felix, was robbed, shot, and killed in Puerto Rico. He was 39 years old. He had been living in the Dominican Republic since 2004, but he was still friends with the rest of Lee's family. It was yet another blow for a family that was already struggling to recover from a tragic loss. If Matthew Borges does receive parole in 2047, he will be 46 years old. He will still have time to make amends, but nothing can bring back Lee or bring peace to his heartbroken family. Thank you for watching, you guys. As always, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more exciting content. Until next time, and stay safe. It's a really strange world out there.